Up next on Inside the SCCA, the circuit at Buttonwillow gets its first Super Tour. Welcome to episode 2213, I think, of Inside the SCCA. I'm Brian Bielanski. Of course, Inside the SCCA brought to you by raceschool.com. Today, we're talking about the new racetrack at Buttonwillow, the circuit, and its first Super Tour coming up here in a couple of days. My guest today is a guy who knows a little bit about the new racetrack, Michael Lewis. Michael, how are you today?
Great, Brian. Thanks for having me on.
Great to have you here. 10-time national champion, like 1,000 times on the podium. I'm exaggerating a little bit. You've done just about everything in the SCCA, board member, the whole spiel. It's been great to have you on the show. We're going to get to the circuit in just a little bit here. You were there for our inaugural race last, 2-3 weeks ago? And you got to run the first official lap, I guess. Ceremonial lap. That was pretty cool, huh?
It was. As you get older, which I unfortunately am, you start to value these little pieces of history more, I think, or at least recognize the value of them. And, I was around for the opening of the original Buttonwillow. Of course, I was, that was many, many years ago, and I was certainly nowhere near where I am now as far as what I've done in the sport.
Right.
And when this opportunity came around, it doesn't come around very often to be the first guy to do the first lap, or the first official lap anyway. So I was interested in doing that, and they set up a little lottery type thing, and it got a little bit more than I wanted to invest, and so I sort of unfortunately stepped aside on that. And lo and behold, I have the ultimate racing wife. She actually went over and just with a mere seconds left, put in a winning bid, and there I was out on the track, and it hit me a little bit because I understand what it means. With these tracks are going to be around long after I'm gone.
Yeah.
And it's just nice to have a little marker that hey, we were here and we were part of it.
It's funny when you did the lap. You did like a reconnaissance lap before the official lap, and I'm out there putting the cameras up for our live stream broadcast, and I get the call. All right, it's going to be hot. I'm like, oh, if there's anybody who's not going to be running me over, it's going to be Michael, so I don't have to worry about that. But that was a lot of fun to see you do that. So a little later in the show, we're actually going to talk about the circuit and what it is and how the track layout works and what you like or what you might not like. And I will tell you that, and you've probably heard this, most everybody loved the track. Maybe better for some cars than others, but generally speaking, the reviews came in pretty positive. So we will get to that in just a little bit. And but we do this show, and every show that we've had for the first time a person has been on the show since episode number 1, we start it the exact same way. And it's with one simple question, Michael, and it is this: how did you get mixed up in this sport that we love?
Yeah, I'm sure you have 1,000 different answers. I have to thank my dad for it, really. He was a racing fan from way back. He was an airline pilot and was soloed at 16 in the small New York town that he was from. And he always loved mechanical things. So he just developed a love for, in particular, Formula One, but IndyCar and motorsports in general. So I wound up in Southern California, which is where I grew up. I wound up getting dragged up to Riverside quite a bit. And it wasn't dragging, actually. I was happy to go.
Sure.
And saw just about every, just saw legends of the sport: Bruce McLaren, Parnelli Jones, Donahue, Andretti, the IndyCar, Can-Am, Trans Am, even NASCAR. And it just got into my blood, and that's where it all started for me. And then from there, I sort of had to engineer my own way. My dad was a fan. He didn't participate, so I had to get into a racing school, something called the British School of Motor Racing
Huh.
from way back in the day, and got my feet wet. Then ran into a couple guys. I started working down here in San Diego. Ran into a couple guys who were running SCCA racing, and that's how I jumped into SCCA. And I'm actually still with the main guy who got me into it back then, a guy named David Steele, who's my crew chief and great friend. We still race together today. So that's how it all started for me. And I know my dad unfortunately passed away about 20 years ago, but he really appreciated coming out to the track and being part of it.
That's awesome. And of course, Dad being a pilot, getting interested in Formula One and IndyCar made perfect sense because those are essentially upside down airplanes.
Exactly.
Very cool. Very cool. So you've had quite the career. Besides the fact that you're a 10-time national champion, you've done a lot of professional racing as well. Tell us a little bit about the progression from that first school that you went to back in the day to where we got today.
Yeah, as I like to say, and I always have, I'm sort of a product of the SCCA unofficial ladder system. You hear a lot about the Mazda ladder,
Right.
Road to Indy, whatever you got. Well, back then, there was ways that you could sort of climb the ladder, and it was an unofficial ladder, as I said. But you went from like IT racing, which is regional.
Right.
Then we jumped into GT3 with an RX3, and ran quite a bit with that. So went to our first runoffs in that car. Then jumped into building our own, or having our own car built, or building our own car with a guy named Don Preston, who I think everyone's familiar with, and running up in the nationals and the runoffs eventually with that car. And that's where we had one of our first runoffs win was in that car. And from there, I dabbled up into both IMSA a little bit, but mostly the target was Trans Am,
Mm-hmm.
as my wherewithal as a small businessman sort of allowed me to. I was able to procure a Mustang from Tom Gloy, and we went out and did a few races, then took a shot at Rookie of the Year Trans Am, and ran quite a few years of that. Ran pretty strongly for a privateer, I like to think. Got some wins and some podiums, and finished top 3 in the championship back when it was a chore to do that with the Gloy teams and the Roushes
Yep.
and the Gentilozzi teams. I mean, they didn't leave much scraps on the table for us privateer guys. And then from there, I pushed on into ALMS, which allowed me to drive those cars, which are just wonderful. We drove
Yeah.
a prototype, and that took me to Le Mans. And to me, that's the pinnacle if you're a sports car driver is Le Mans. So I feel so fortunate to have been able to go through all those steps and emerge there and just have a magical experience in France. Didn't have a tremendous amount of success in my 2 trips there, but it's a story of itself in itself as well.
Yeah.
But feel very fortunate, and like I said, now I've gone back a few steps on the ladder. Now that I'm older and I got a family to consider, can't be on the road all the time. So I'm running the club racing where I came from.
Yeah. Very cool. How long ago was the Trans Am days?
We got involved in that in the late 90s and then into the early 2000s.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's great stuff. I didn't realize that Gloy was still involved that late into the Trans Am days. I thought he was more through the late 80s, early 90s, back in the Merkur XR4 Ti days.
No, he had some Mustangs he ran with Brian Simo and a few other people, and Dorsey,
Yep.
and some, I raced against Dorsey. Spun him out once, claim to fame there.
Yep.
But yeah, they had a little bit of a presence there, as did Roush with Tommy Kendall and John Gooding and other people, and as well as Paul Gentilozzi and some other people. Greg Pickett had a big team back then, so yeah.
So now you're here doing mostly SCCA stuff, or I guess it's exclusively SCCA these days?
Yeah, pretty much.
You are one of the early adopters of the double dipper, and actually you're like a quadruple dipper on some weekends. We think of you mostly as a Mazda guy. You've got that beautiful blue RX-7 that you bring out all the time. You also have the Jaguar. When did you decide that you wanted to run multiple cars, multiple races per weekend?
It was really just a practicality thing. As you know, racing is a lot of waiting,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm not the most patient guy. And after a while, I just came to the conclusion: look, I've got these two cars, or I've got access to one car, and I've got my own car, and I said, if I'm going to take this time away from my family and things I'm doing, I want to do more than run for 30 to 40 minutes a
Right.
day, especially at the runoffs, which really drags on if you so it just made sense for me to run multiple classes and sort of get twice the bang for the buck. And
Right.
that's really the only motivation I've ever had. And now we run three classes, and that keeps us pretty busy.
So do you run 3 classes with 3 different cars?
Now the Mazda changes between
Right.
GT3, well, this year GT3U,
Right.
and F production this year. So over the winter, two of my three classes got eliminated, if you will, or merged into other classes. So the changes now are a little bit more severe, unfortunately. But it was an engine change basically between GTL and GT3. Now there's since we have to run DOT tires, which are radials, we also have to actually change a bit of the front suspension as well. So we don't know how that's going to work out yet, but it keeps the crew very busy.
Yeah, I'm sure. Let's talk about those changes for a bit. This is a big moment in time for the club, and obviously some people affected a lot more than others. I have been a longtime advocate, and I'd be hypocritical if I didn't mention it, of the fact that I think we have too many classes. I think it's difficult for people to understand, and there's a rule books thicker than when I was a kid, I grew up in Chicago, rule books thicker than a Chicago phone book. For those of you who don't know what phone books are, Google it. Although while I'm an advocate for slimming things down, I don't completely understand all of the reasoning behind how it all came together. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, and I feel very much the same as you do, and have for quite a number of years. My time on the board, um, I actually pushed and pushed a set of rule changes that would gradually merge a bunch of classes together, and became universally hated for that
Mm-hmm.
because people are just not. I don't know what it is, but they don't seem to grasp the reality that we just can't support this many classes anymore and have real races. And because there's one or two cars in a class, and it's more like a lapping day at that point.
Right.
So that might sound harsh, but it's the way I see it. I'm here to compete, and I want cars in the classes. So I could see that we need to find some places to merge. And one of the places that did it was GT, which is where I lived. I was GT1, GT3,
Right.
GTL. And I don't think there needs to be four classes. I think there needs to be, two or three at the most.
Right.
And in other places, it made sense as well to do some merging. But like I said, it's very sensitive to people. And then you get into the whole, is it a club or is it a business
Right.
argument when it comes to how do you govern it. The truth is it's both.
Yep.
And you have to, you can't, you're going to tread on some toes. There's going to be some blood on the floor, to put it,
Yeah.
indelicately. And unfortunately, there just wasn't the will to do that. I tried to do it sort of the democratic method through the board and voting and putting it out to the membership. And like I said, a lot of people just took it very, very hard and personally. But now I see the club is just basically doing it. They're just mandating it, and either get on or get with the program and continue, or you step off. And I think that's the way it probably has to be done.
Yeah. It's one of those things where there's no way to make everybody happy.
Absolutely.
And we do have large constituency of classes with really strong participation, and it always goes, well, they're getting everything they want. Well, they're getting everything they want because they're showing up every weekend. And it's hard to find the right balance of how to do it. The one thing I was hoping for when I was hearing about consolidation of classes and how it's done is that we'd have a way to create more track time on a race weekend. and maybe that is a way that we're going to get to at some point in time. But the one thing I was kind of surprised by is that we consolidated all these classes, and we're still running 6 or 7 or 8 groups a weekend, and we really haven't added track time, except for maybe that we'll have less yellow flag time, and we might be able to spend more time in our sessions in green flag racing, which I think is a potential result of this. But that was my only disappointment in what we've got right now. What we have now isn't what it's going to be forever. But I would have liked to see a way to get it down to maybe 4 or 5 race groups, and we get, 45-minute races and 2 or 3 qualifying sessions out of it.
And I agree. That was one of the byproducts that we looked at even back then. Although, you do have to remove quite a bit to eliminate an entire race group's worth of classes. That's a bit of consolidation, and they haven't quite gotten there yet. But I do agree that that's one of the things that we need to offer people is some more time on the track, which goes back to my motivation to do more than one class, because that's really what I was looking for. Is I want to be out on the track more.
Yeah. The other thing with double dipping or triple dipping is that, most of the expense of a race weekend is getting the cars to the racetrack, the hotels, the food. When you add another $500 or $600 for a race entry, or I don't know what it's at for Super Tours now, that's almost the lesser cost of all of it. And you get more bang for your bucks when you do the double or triple dipping.
Yeah. Absolutely. You're so right on the point, is that getting the car ready, getting it to the track, getting your people to the track, taking care of them while they're at the track, then getting them all back home. That's the huge infrastructure deal part of it. And you're right. I mean, I don't want to be flippant because, I've reached a point in my life now where, entry fees aren't a real thing to me.
Right.
If I want to do something, I'm going to do it. But I know there are smaller racers and guys that are bootstrapping it who where every dollar matters.
Right.
And I'm sympathetic to that as well. But yeah, we just have to, the economic reality and the reality of we need to build our driver group up, our driver population up, whereas it's been in decline for many years now.
Yeah.
I haven't looked at the numbers lately, but it was on a down glide, and we just have to stop that erosion if we're gonna still be viable in another decade. Yeah.
You've raced at Le Mans, and at Le Mans in particular, there's some pretty wild speed discrepancies. And do you think we could combine some more classes into race groups to cut the groups down? I know there's always the compatibility of, speed differential and size of cars, but I feel like we could do maybe one big bore closed wheel, one small bore closed wheel, and really kind of that could be a way. Obviously, on some bigger race weekends, it's tough when we got bigger numbers. But on a lot of race weekends, I think we can drive well enough to work with that. Do you think that's possible?
Yeah, I mean, any driver will tell you that even if 2 cars that are lapping very similar lap times, how they derive that lap time always has to be considered. Whether it's cornering or top speed. Some classes are, one of my classes, GT1, it's very hard to combine with almost anything else because the closing speeds are so frightening.
Right.
And I understand that. I understand that that's a liability for my class, GT1. And that, in the future, I hope we find some way to do that. But I think you're right. If the drivers can be trusted to behave themselves, and there are signs in both directions right now. I see some really questionable driving out there. But I also see a lot of guys being mindful of things and saying, I don't want to have to go full course yellow because I'm making this bonsai move.
Right.
And they're holding back a little. So I see progress in that direction, and I hope it keeps going. And if you have that kind of understanding, then yes, you can combine a lot more classes and maybe eliminate an entire group. And I think that's a worthwhile goal for sure.
Yeah. And part of it comes down to officiating. And now we're going to go back to the club versus a business thing. And the fact that a lot of our race officials are our friends. We're at the racetrack with them every weekend. You might have been driving with them 20 years ago and now they're a steward or whatever the case may be. But I hear people screaming loudly that if we would just officiate better, people would drive smarter because they would be afraid of this or that or the other thing. And then when I hear someone get a penalty, they light up social media that it's a club and we should be welcoming. It's a terrible balance to try to make.
Yeah, I believe that's true. And again, it goes back to that: is this a business or is it a club? And the truth is, it's both.
Right.
And at certain times, one half of that equation has to overrule the other half. And it's a very fine line. And racers are very type A personalities. They're going to see it, one way one day and hypocritically the other way the next day, depending on their circumstance. But yeah, I think the important thing is when you're talking about driving etiquette and penalties, and I think that yes, you can affect things and things could be improved. But in order for that to happen, we need to have more drivers, uh, ex-drivers, if you will, or current drivers filtering into roles uh, in some way, because some of the decisions that come out are very curious to you as
Mm-hmm.
a driver, in that it just seems so obvious when you're looking at the playback of it. We've got the video now,
Right.
and some of the decisions made are just a little mysterious at times. And it's not an easy answer. I don't want to throw it out there. I think the club is trying to move in the correct direction, but yes, it's still a major problem, and people just their patience is very thin now.
Yeah.
If they come out and they invest a lot of time and effort and money, and the slightest bit of a snub, they just go elsewhere, and
Yeah.
so you have to be sensitive to that, and it's a tough one.
Yeah, it is. One of the things we want to talk about is we've got some kids coming up the ranks here, and they're going to be at the racetrack with us this weekend, and we're going to talk about that. But this kind of works in. So I've had the good fortune to have watched almost every single Super Tour race for the last 2 years because I'm behind the microphone. And I've watched every Runoffs race for the last 3 years. I go back afterwards doing my Super Tour homework and watch the Runoffs races. And I hear a lot of people, these kids have no respect, and they don't drive over their head, and blah 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 blah. I see as much, if not more, junkie driving, and that's what I like to call it, from people who've been doing this in this club for 20 years, as I do the kids. So I think it's an easy mark to say, oh, it's the kids, but everybody has to be more mindful of their driving, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And there are some really young guys and girls coming up through the ranks now, and a lot of them, the majority of them, I think, are excellent. They've had proper training, and they get a lot of seat time, much more than I did when I was that age, for sure.
Absolutely.
Uh, and 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 it's true. Some of the harder heads out there are some that have a lot of gray hair on them. So
Mm-hmm.
you see the mistakes certainly from both sides of the equation. I do think that there is a certain amount of maturity that you get when you're paying for all your own stuff and
Yep.
you're having to put it all back together again after a race weekend, that maybe some of the younger kids don't really experience, but they're tremendously talented. I don't know how to address that other than strong stewarding,
Right.
and which we just spoke about. But yeah, I don't see. I've been up against a couple kids, and they're just sterling in their driving, and I've had no issue with that. But the classes I'm in aren't typically the ones where the younger kids are.
Right.
I think in Spec Racer and Spec Miata, you see a little bit of that. But I see some of these kids running up at the front, and they're just tremendously talented.
Yeah. Ethan Goulart, our 15-year-old national champion in Spec Miata last year, is a perfect example of that.
Absolutely, what a race he ran.
Absolutely. Yeah, no question. Sometimes I think some of the older drivers are just trying to not let the kids get past them, and they're trying to maybe they're frustrated that they're getting beat by the kids, and maybe they're driving a little harder than they used to, you know?
That's it. It's no one wants to get old, but as they say, Father Time is undefeated. So,
Yep.
but we don't want to go quietly.
No question. No question. So we've got some kids. You mentioned you wanted to talk about this a little bit. What do you think about what we got coming up at Buttonwillow as far as the younger drivers this weekend?
I'm unaware of the. I know there's some young. I see the names on the entry list
Right.
and things. Uh, I know that the interest in the sport is at an all-time high in a lot of
Yep.
ways with Drive to Survive and a lot of those type things. So the kids are interested. I just look at my kids. They're not going to be racing this weekend, but they're going to be out there doing a track day. Before that, in a full-size car. So they've been heroes on K1 speed circuits
Sure.
for a few years now, and now they've been on one semi-lapping day at Road Atlanta, but now they're going to spend a day in a more serious car, and they're just very enthusiastic about it. And we have to find a way to integrate these kids and to make them welcome. And if they do need to be uh, pull the reins back a little bit, so to speak, we need to find a way to do that that's both fair and still inviting as a club. So,
Well,
but yeah.
one of the things that the SCCA has done in conjunction with Mazda at the Super Tours is they have, at most of the Super Tours, a driver advocate, for lack of a better term. And it's a driver. It's been a lot of the times Greg Amie, and it's been his position to basically be there to counsel drivers, young and old, but maybe more so the younger ones, about driving styles, driving decision making, and even having discussions before they go out to get in their mind what they should be thinking about. And I think that's been a real positive addition to the Super Tours. It would be great if our regions could have someone similar, maybe someone with the talent of a Michael Lewis, to be able to do that kind. I'm not setting you up, but we've got a lot of really talented older drivers who could play that mentor role either while they're racing or pick a weekend where they're not driving to come out and do that kind of stuff. And I think that goes a long way.
I mean, how much more perfect an advice can you have of a concept, an idea? Certainly nothing I had when I came up.
Right.
The school of hard knocks, which in itself, in its own way, is valuable. But to have an actual mentor, if you will, sort of overlooking your practice sessions and just having a conversation with you after every session, maybe making some suggestions. God, once again, Mazda doing the job for
Yep.
SCCA, a tremendous partner, and obviously I'm involved with Mazda, but gee, they just keep finding new ways to to
Yep.
to, to make things exciting and helpful and inviting. And I have seen every now and then on an entry form where they're asking if you'll sign up to be a mentor.
Mm-hmm.
And it's hard for me generally because I've got so many races going
Right.
during the weekend. And usually, if I'm flying in and out, that's a real problem. I'm
Yeah.
usually on my way to an airport or something on a Sunday. But I would love to do that, and it's more possible for me to do that locally, which
Sure.
is Southern California. So I would definitely consider that, and I will, because you're right. It's very valuable, and not just for the young driver, but usually they have a family around them,
Yep.
and they would appreciate it as well,
Yep.
seeing that type of effort made by the region.
And it's also real important that it's not an official. It's not a steward. So the
Right.
conversation, it's at a different level. It's more of a contemporary almost, rather than, Mr. Operating Steward, Mr. Safety Steward coming by. Because as soon as you have the white shirt on, it's almost like white coat syndrome when you go to the doctor and your blood pressure is higher than it always is. When you've got someone who could be in a disciplinary role, it's just a different dynamic.
Yeah, absolutely. I can see exactly what you're saying, and it's so true. Uh, it's a whole different vibe, if you
Yep.
will.
Yep.
So yes, I think as a fellow driver, maybe if you're not in the same class, I think a lot more value and in doing that way. Yeah.
So we're gonna take a short little break here. I'm gonna thank the folks who helped me do the show here. When we come back, I want to talk a little bit about runoffs on the West Coast. I want to talk a little bit about the relevance of the SCCA in today's motorsports world. And then we're going to talk about actually the circuit at Buttonwillow. So, Michael, hang with me for a minute while I thank some folks, and then we'll be back in about maybe a minute or so. It doesn't take long here. Big thank you. This is Inside the SCCA, brought to you by raceschool.com. That's the logo over my shoulder. Cannot thank those folks enough. They are based out here in Southern California. Raceschool.com does SCCA licensing school, defensive driving, driving, performance driving, tons of different things based at Buttonwillow. They also do a little bit of work out at Willow Springs as well. It's a destination because our weather out here most of the time is awesome, and you don't have to worry about your school getting washed out. People come from all over the country to do their schools out here. So check them out, raceschool.com. Also want to thank our good friends at Solo Performance Specialties. They are at most of the National Tour events. Also online, if you need stuff for your solo program, they are great folks there. Check out Dave and his people. Ray Esports, the official sim racing league of Inside the SCCA. I love hanging out with Stevie Way and racing his races. If I wasn't recording this podcast on a Saturday afternoon, I'd be racing the Spec Racer Ford right now in one of Stevie Ray's esports events, and he's a great guy. And most of his races involve SCCA drivers, so we try to act like it's an actual race so we don't run each other over because it's a sim most of the time. Anyway, that's a good time there. Also want to thank William R. Penterick and Associates, David Penterick. You know Dave, Michael. He is a GT1 driver, also playing with the kids in Spec MX5 these days. David is got a financial planning firm, and he's a big supporter of Inside the SCCA. Thank you for being part of what we do. All right, we're back now with Michael Lewis here. A couple things. So back when you and I got started, SCCA was the ladder system for most professional motorsports in North America. If you wanted to go open wheel racing, you go through Formula Atlantic. Remember, Formula Super V was a big deal back in the day. Yeah. Guys like Ray Hall and Unser and Andretti all came through the SCCA, if not for a long stint, a short stint, and that's how they got to where they are. GT1 was a stepping stone to Trans Am like you did, and IMSA. There was a spot in our world, our SCCA world, starting around maybe 2000 until about 5 years ago, where I felt a little bit like the relevance of SCCA kind of went away. If you wanted to go open wheel racing, you went through the Skip Barber program and all their stuff, and you just skipped over SCCA altogether. There wasn't a lot of stepping between SCCA and the sports car ranks. Today, we've got a handful of guys, mostly guys, who are now going and using SCCA as a stepping stone. Connor Zilic, Morgan Burkhart, Jason Pribble is racing in Europe, started in Formula FE2 here. Do you see the SCCA product, when I say product, I mean drivers that we produce, getting a little different look these days than they have maybe in the last 10, 15 years?
Yeah, I do. And again, being a sort of a student of the history of things, I do go back and the names that you mentioned, along with Villeneuve and a number of other people in the open wheel, particularly, but also in the closed wheel, it was a cavalcade of the future of the stars. And SCCA was very fortunate in some ways because it sort of fell upon them due to the fact that they'd been around the longest and were the organization that was in existence.
Right.
And then, of course, through no fault of their own, but also the SCCA has contributed to some of this erosion. Other racing series came into and we can have a conversation entirely different about how all that happened and you know, reasons for why. But a lot of, oh my God, I can't even name all the open wheel series that are out there now. That run on pro weekends and SVRA weekends, and so there's a number of different of paths, if you will, and some of them are quite attractive, and the dilution of that, you know, there's only so many young drivers that are really aiming to make this a career. So when you dilute their presence, I think it hurts everyone. I think it hurts them in that they're not racing against the cream of the crop in one or two places in particular. And yeah, so I think you did see that. And I have noticed lately that, again, with the Connor Zilic, I mean, he is a prime example. And some of the other names you mentioned, these are supremely talented kids. And they do seem to be choosing the SCCA. And the SCCA needs to be more focused on that. But see, again, it's a dichotomy of things. Are we a club, you know, where I just want to come out and run my 63 TR4 around the car, or do I want to be, or do we want to be more of a serious racing situation? And so what you find is that some classes like FE and stuff like that obviously are a little more serious, and then we have classes that are a little more relaxed, if you will. And I don't know how much of that is by plan, but I think it's happening. And I think there are little pockets in the SCCA and the names that you point out, like Beck Miata, even SRF, where some of these names are coming through there, and it's very useful.
Yeah.
And I don't know how much of that is by plan, I guess is what I'm getting to. But it seems to be coming back, and it's certainly welcome to see.
Yeah, I think the open wheel series that you spoke about, there's the Pacific Formula 2000 series, there's FRP on the East Coast. I think our small bore open wheel group is the one that's been hurt the most by those series.
Yeah.
There's so many options now where there's lots of cars racing, and that whole small bore situation right now has been a big point of consternation for those groups of drivers. But I think those series, that was where it affected the SCCA the most recently, is that there's other places with a lot more competition, not necessarily better competition, just 25 cars versus 8.
Right.
So all right, let's talk about runoffs. You have 10 national champions. I lost count of the podium finishes. I think it's in excess of 20. I know it's in excess of 20, maybe even close to 30. You've done a lot of runoffs. Have you missed one at all in the last 10, 15 years?
Well, when I went, there was sort of a gentleman's agreement way back when I went Trans Am racing to where the pros don't come down and rain on the amateur parade. And I pretty well stuck to that. So I disappeared for a number of years when I was pro racing.
Got it.
And then when I came back, started doing it full time, I would just go off and do a Trans Am race here and there. So nowadays you don't see that blurred line. We had, God knows, we had pro Trans Am champions entering the runoffs not too long ago, which I was not totally in favor of. But yeah, I've done a lot. I did a lot before I went to the pro stuff, and now I haven't missed a year since I came back. I think starting in like 2002 or three or something like that. So yeah, a lot of races, and you only remember the ones that got away from you. It's but great experience. Obviously, I'm a big believer in the runoffs.
So a couple years back, I guess mid 20-teens, we had the runoffs come back out here to the West Coast. They were out here many, many, many years ago at Riverside, I believe. Came back. We did one at Sonoma, one at Laguna Seca, right?
Right.
And then they went back east, and we haven't seen them since. I know why. Not as highly subscribed. West Coast drivers seem to be more apt to drive across the mountain than the East Coast drivers coming our direction. Because they always had to. I mean, it just became part of what West Coast drivers decided they needed to do if they wanted to win a national championship. So it's kind of already been baked into the costs of their program if that's what they wanted. East Coast drivers, not so much. They were spoiled, honestly, with the runoffs being at Road Atlanta for 2 decades, 3 decades, and then Mid Ohio for 10 years, and then all of the different places. When we held the runoffs out here, they did not have huge car counts, but they're not coming back anytime soon. I got the impression, and you have definitely thoughts about that.
Yeah, and it's the one thing I did on the board that I'm most proud of is I really kind of forced the hand and said we have got to get back to the West Coast. So I see that as my crowning achievement on the board after 45 to 50 years. It finally got it back out to the West Coast, and then 2 or 3 years later we had another one, and then I left the board, term limits and all that, and other things in life happening. But when I left, it was in place that, of course, as you mentioned earlier in the interview, I don't expect it to be out here in a rotating business every other year.
Right.
What we had sort of worked out informally is once every 3 or 4 years, to come out here. And I also was in favor of sort of having which has worked out anyway, is having a rotation like the NFL does with the Super Bowl.
Right.
Not every city's going to have a Super Bowl. They have like 5 or 6 cities that really sort of host it because they have the infrastructure and the vibe and all that. And that was what I was sort of trying to do, is that there'd be 2 or 3 tracks on the West Coast, and then we come back and visit that, and then do 2 or 3 more years on the East, because I understand the reality of it, is that it's more profitable when it's on the East Coast. It's greater draw. But I really believe that they needed to keep it out here longer than they did. I think there was real grassroots shooting up of interest of West Coast guys that were interested in the runoffs and we're going to dedicate some time to it. And then they got the rug pull not too long ago.
Yeah.
And I think that's damaging. I think that we need to look at the country as a whole. It's become so East Coast, West Coast diametric that obviously I walk on both sides of that, but not everyone has the resources I have.
Right.
So
Right.
a guy who could aim his program out here in the West Coast and say, okay, every 3 years I got the runoffs, and I'm going to make that a focal point. And guys might build a new car or improve the car they have or whatever. And all that impetus was taken away when they not only didn't come back and didn't put out some spin like we'll keep it under consideration. No, they flat out put a letter out that said we're never coming back.
Right.
And that was the disrespect to that I thought was just unnecessary and insulting to the West Coast programs. It's just a shame because I wanted to move around. I'm not in favor of multi-year contracts either for the runoffs. I was in favor of moving it around like the baseball does with the All-Star game. They don't put it in Kansas City for 3 years. They move it to a different city, and the runoffs is the jewel, and it should be moved around as well.
Yeah.
But the national office, it's easier for them to do it at the same place that they've done it before because it's all baked in how they do it, and I understand that. But they're very capable people. They showed how they could do it coming out here on one-offs. And so I'm not only in favor of a West Coast runoffs every 3 or 4 years, but also moving it every year, not having these multi-year contracts. But I understand that track rentals and things that I'm not aware of from where I sit now
Right.
May factor into that. If you don't give it to a track for 2 or 3 years, they may not let you have it year one. So I'm not totally privy to it, but yeah, I just think there was a missed opportunity there, and I still do.
Right. Yeah, as I understand it, and again, I do have a fairly strong relationship with the folks at National. I do not. This podcast is specifically not sponsored by the SCCA, so that you and I can have a tough conversation like this, and I don't have to worry about them pulling the plug on me. But I do.
That.
I am the Super Tour announcer, so I do have a relationship, and so I get to talk to people. And I'll be honest with you, I pick up the phone and call Mike Cobb, and Mike Cobb picks up the phone for me. And so I love that, and I think it helps with the podcast because I can share some things. I do understand from my discussions is that tracks prefer to commit to at least 2 years. It's a big commitment to put on a runoffs, no matter where it's at, and it's just easier to get tracks to do it for a 2-year contract. That said, we could do 2 years at 2 different tracks, and then the 5th year come out west and do it for a race. And we have some really iconic, legendary racetracks out here. Willow, or not Willow, but Willow is, but I don't think Willow could support a runoff. It just doesn't have enough paddock, even though they've done the track again. But, Sonoma, Laguna Seca, these are places that people on the East Coast dream about driving at, and you would think once every, even if we did 5 years, two tracks on the East Coast and once out here, you would think that you could bake in enough profit from the 4 races previous to spend a little bit of money to come out west and make everybody happy because we are a club of 50 states plus some other stuff, not just the states on the other side of the Rockies.
Yeah, you're preaching to the choir, my friend.
Yep.
I agree with everything you've said there, and hopefully the attitude will change. I too was very close to the staff of the national office. I'm a great believer in a lot of the talent there.
Yep.
Eric Prill, I talked to him quite a bit, and we have it out in emails with each other every now and then, and it's healthy because I know he's looking at it from one side of things, and I'm trying to look at it from the racer and the competitor and the West Coaster side. So I try to represent, but yeah, like I said, hopefully it starts to move in a different direction in the not too distant future.
All right. It's time. Let's talk about what's coming up here. This is, we're recording it on Saturday, but we're going to air this in a couple of days just before the Super Tour round out here at Buttonwillow. This year, for the first time, because it just opened, at the circuit, We opened the track 2 or 3 weeks ago, had a great first event, even with all of the growing pains and the challenges that come with any first event at any racetrack or any kind of venue. I always tell people, you never want to go to a restaurant in the opening month unless you've got tickets, unless you're going the opening night, because they work really hard to get the opening night off the ground great. And then the next month is a complete Shiite show because they're just trying to get it going. And it's the same way with any kind of venue or racetrack or whatever. You've got growing pains. And we had a little bit of them, but we had a fun time. The track seemingly happy and people happy that we're driving on it. What was your impression of the circuit at Buttonwillow?
Well, it's been a long time coming, as you know.
For sure.
We've had an opening race scheduled for, I think, over 2 years.
Yeah.
And I appreciate the fact that things came up where they could have kicked it down the can down the road again, and they didn't. They said, no, we're sticking to it this time. I don't know if you've mentioned that the buildings aren't inspected by the state yet because there's some issue with manpower or something at this point in time, and they're not able to use any of the main buildings, and it's a real challenge. But they're getting around that. They're putting a big tent up to have the dinner and the awards show on, or the awards program on this upcoming weekend, and that was kind of the spirit of the whole weekend. I thought they did incredibly well. I thought the track was the least of the issues,
Right.
which normally, I mean, the worker positions that it didn't come up anywhere. There were no curbs that were damaged. There was no standing water anywhere. The track was just awesome.
Yeah.
And the way that Cal Club, which they're just great at running races, they did. It just always reminds me when I come back here, the hot poles they do in the places they do them are just incredible. And yet it keeps the races green, which keeps the schedule going and keeps the races flow going. And I know as drivers, we really appreciate that. But so Cal Club's just a world beater in my book. And they did an incredible job putting it together. The schedule was bang on every day. That doesn't happen in most veteran racetracks, much less a brand new one. And I just couldn't have been happier with the way it came off more. And the track is very racy.
Yeah. What? How would you describe it? Technical, not technical, speed track? It's got some decent straightaways, a lot of banking. What would you compare it to?
Yeah, I struggle to know. I think it's a mix between, like you say, there's some elevation changes, like the whole Madness complex at Mid-Ohio.
Yep.
There's basically a dead ringer for Oak Tree Corner at VIR out there, and that's always been one of the more difficult separate the men from the boys corners, and this one does as well, getting it right. I think I got it right maybe 4 times out of 10.
Yep.
So I'm aiming to improve on that this weekend. It's not so much a GT1 track. There is certainly straight line, obviously enough to get it done, but you can't not everything can beat Road America.
Sure.
You know?
Nor should it be.
But for almost every other class, the straightaways are plenty long. There's passing opportunities, not just in one location, but in probably 3 or 4. There's only one place where it gets to be follow the leader, where if you get caught behind somebody slow, it's going to really damage your lap. It's a very challenging tap. There's a lot of technicality to it for sure. And as I came in after my first session, I said, well, it's a very technical track. It's enjoyable to drive. I wonder how it's going to race. And then we went out and did some races, and you could pass people, and it raced very well too. So
yeah,
I think it gets high marks in every regard from me.
Worth the wait, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's only going to get better. There's a little thing which I mentioned to them to where the pit lane entrance releases right into where cars are trying to use that same area for exit from corner 1. So they need to do a little bit of delineation there to keep them away from each other. But other than that, it was just amazing how well it was done. The corner stations looked great. The workers were well well protected and covered and cared for. And we have some great corner workers out here. So it was just wonderful.
Yeah, I certainly was very impressed with, despite all of the stuff that was happening off the racetrack. And, like you said, the buildings aren't ready to be used yet. The state's backed up in their inspector program, and they haven't been able to get someone out. But we soldiered on, and everyone seemed to have fun. And there were some food trucks out there to help with the additional need, because the restaurant is inside the building, which we're not allowed to be in yet. So,
Yeah.
but that was it was nice to have the food trucks there. That was kind of cool.
It was.
It was really kind of a different atmosphere because of all of that, right?
Little throwback to when I
Yeah.
first started in the 80s and the late 70s. A little bit of a throwback to where you didn't have a lot of permanent restaurants. They were
Right.
all food trucks, and or you bought your own bologna.
Yep.
So it was a little bit of a throwback that way, and I like that. But I can't wait to be able to use the facilities for sure.
Yeah. No question. No
Yeah.
question. Any thoughts going into this weekend of what you want to do, what you want to accomplish? I mean, you're always one of our guys at the front of the pointy end of your races. It's going to be a fun weekend.
Yeah, unfortunately, it looks like the Jag will probably run alone. Unfortunately,
Oh,
the GT1 is a little it's a little scarce, a little weak on the West Coast, and I know when we go up to the Northwest, there's a bunch of guys waiting to kick my ass up there. So later in the year, but down here, there seems to be a little bit of a shortage of that. But in F production, which I'm now in, there's like 6 cars, I believe, so that's great. So that'll be a focal point for us, and we're still trying to adjust to the new rules on that. And also in GT3U, we're really trying to adjust going to the radial tires, and I'm going to be doing a little bit of running earlier in the week next week before the weekend, trying to figure out just how to get these radials to work,
right.
DOT radials compared to the slicks that we used to run. So those are the two things that we're aiming at, is just trying to get the car optimized for these new rule sets.
Speaking of rules and speaking of GT1, let's make this our parting question. Had Andy Lally on the show on our 5th anniversary for our 5th season first show. He's now the new president of Trans Am.
Yes.
We talked a little bit about Trans Am as it relates to SCCA club racing. With the lack of numbers in GT1, and while it's more so on the West Coast than on the East Coast, even in the East Coast, there's not a ton of drivers out there driving GT1 these days. It used to be
Right.
you'd go to
Right.
the runoffs or any big national event, and everybody would stop what they were doing and go to the fence to watch the start or part of the GT1 race and the part of the Formula Atlantic races. These were the creme de la creme classes, like the best of the best. And now, Formula Atlantic, not a lot of drivers in it. GT1, not a lot of drivers in it. There's a lot of things that factor in that. How much do you think, though, the GT1 getting poached into Trans Am in the past is part of why GT1's struggling in some parts?
Well, it certainly is a factor, I think, without doubt, and not so much now, but the damage is done. But certainly was for like the previous 5, 6, 7 years,
Yeah,
where guys because they were really hurting for entries in Trans Am. Nowadays, they're okay. They don't have huge fields, but they're okay. But they were really hurting back then. So yeah, they'd come down and poach, and we would make it easy for them to come in and run and qualify for the runoffs. And again, I thought that was a strategic error because it drove a lot of guys out
right.
who are amateurs, saying, "My God, not only are you we have to deal with these guys, you're making it easy for them to come in and poach the national championship." So that's my feeling on it, and I, as I said, I come from a generation where you didn't see Dorsey Schrader coming down and running the championship, or Tommy Kendall, or any of those big teams. They just didn't do it.
Right.
It just wasn't done. But I understand times have changed. So I think now, yeah, they're trying to. I don't know what the answer is. We struggle to get 10 cars every year at the runoffs.
Yeah,
It's a real challenge every year, and if you don't get that, you don't even have a national championship race. In
right.
which case, I'm not even going out if there's nothing to run for.
Yeah,
So I don't know what the answer is. There's a bunch of cars that are parked. I don't know what their level of happiness or unhappiness is. I wish we could get them back out to do the amateur thing, but it seems like everybody who's funded and can do things in a larger way is drawn to the Trans Am field, and it seems like a real push pull there all the time between us. And I looked at doing maybe a one-off Trans Am race here or there this year, but unfortunately, I'm a Goodyear guy, and they don't allow Goodyear tires in there, so I
yeah.
couldn't make it work. But Yeah, I don't know what the answer is. I think the damage was done a few years ago. I don't know how to reach out and get those guys back involved. I know Tony Ave is interested in trying to make sure that GT1 survives on the club level. I sure am. I think David Pinteric, that you mentioned, he's one of the OG guys
Yep.
to it, and I think we'd love to see some more entries, but I don't know what the answer is completely.
And I don't know the answer to this question, which is why I'm going to ask it. Is GT2, GT1, is there a way to bring those all together into one class?
I think you would have to restrict the GT1 cars. So they're hard to mix with
Yeah.
anything, and that's the problem. Some of these GTX, these supercars,
Yeah, the Lamborghini Huracan.
yeah, stuff like that. They've made some moves there, and there's one guy there, Mike McAleenan,
Yep.
who's a friend of mine from the Northwest,
Darn good race
and
car
a, and
driver.
and a good shoe. Yeah,
Yeah.
he's been around for a while. People haven't heard him, but he's been around for a while. He knows how to wheel that thing. And if we could get a few more of those cars, and they have the wherewithal to run up with us, I don't think you can bring us down to GT2 level,
Right.
is I guess is what I'm getting at, because it would hurt our performance so badly. And I don't think that you could speed them up. I think they're quite happy where they are with the formula they have. Talk about a success story. GT2 is practically dead, about 10 years
Yep.
ago? And now it's the strongest GT2 class, or GT class, I should say,
Yeah, no
by far.
question.
And so they've done a good job there. And part of that has to do with TA2 as well. Those
Right.
cars come walking down in there. But it's hard to do at GT1. So hopefully we'll have some more success with these bringing these hybrid cars in. Even though my car is 24 years old and it is showing a little long in the tooth, it can still get up and run there once in a while.
Well, if you're at the racetrack and you want to see two really, really pretty race cars, stop by and see the number 32 blue Mazda and check out that Jaguar, because I got to tell you, if I had all the money in the world, I might be trying to get you a check for that Jaguar. That is a cool-ass race car.
Yeah, we really like it. There's been some idea of trying to upgrade it to the newest bodywork, but I just won't do it. I just want to keep it a Jaguar.
There you go.
So it will always be that way. And I'd
Cool.
like to just say something, Brian, about you. I appreciate your broadcasts. I watch them all the time. And the overall race broadcast, I think, is such a valuable tool for the SCCA. I don't think anyone else is really doing it down at the grassroots level the way we are. And you guys do a wonderful job. It's something I believed on since I was on the board. I was the one who I originally pushed to put. Back then, it was like a letterbox where you'd put 6 cameras around, and they'd all be on the screen. You could sort
Yep.
of follow your car around. And they not only skipped right over that, they went right into full-blown broadcast. And you guys do it at a level now that is just extraordinary. So I would like to thank you guys and you and all your compadres for the jobs you do on that.
Well, I got to tell you, I've got 30 years behind me in network television, and the quality of show that Brendan and Driver's Eye and put on, and Greg and I get to announce is so remarkable considering the budget that we have to play with.
Yeah, I can imagine.
It is, I was like, I worked at the network level. Do I want to be part of this?
Right.
And it is so good with what we have to do it with. And I'm very proud of what we do, and thank you. And we hear this a lot, and I appreciate it so much. We'd love to do it more. We'd love to have man cameras. We'd love to do all that kind of stuff. But the exponential cost increase to do that kind of stuff is completely nutty. But
a lot of bang for the buck.
Yeah.
And my point back then, which is the same today, is I watch every race on the weekend, or a lot of them. The one race I can never watch is my own.
Yeah.
And by what you guys do, I can now go back and look at it. So,
yep. And not that you've mentioned this, if anybody out there who wants to get their business and brand as part of that broadcast, give the SCCA a call. And, the more we can get to support that maybe we can expand the quality of the types of stuff that we do. We have great ideas, but it all just costs money. But that would be fantastic. This is part of the show, Michael. Well, you get to thank the folks that help you do what you do. The floor is yours. Go for it.
All right. First and foremost, I have to thank my wife, Peggy Lewis. She's my number one fan. She's a huge believer in our family, racing as a family. And I love that, and it's worked out real well with our kids. We have a tremendous bond with our kids, and a lot of it has to do with racing.
Yep.
Them going to the track, doing jobs, driving cars now. So that from a car standpoint, Craig Stevens at Stevens Motorsports actually owns the Blue Mazda, which is a car I used to own long ago, and does all the prep work on it, and does the wrenching at the track, changes the engine. I owe a lot to that guy, and our DNFs are almost non-existent. So what a job he does. David Steele is involved with the Jaguar still, along with my son Preston, and we have a bunch of other guys that work with us as well. So I need to thank them. From don't have a lot of sponsors, but Goodyear has been a big supporter of ours for many, many years, and we've loved running with them. They have a great product, and they support us real well. You mentioned Jay Chapman; he's an outstanding guy, and I think that about does it. And the SCCA in general, love it.
Michael, thank you. Appreciate it. I've been trying to find a good time to have you on the show for a while, and I'm glad that we're finally able to make it happen.
Yeah, anytime. I'm always available for you guys.
All right, that's going to do it for another episode of Inside the SCCA, presented by RaceSchool.com. Do you like what you hear? Subscribe to the RacingWire Podcast Network so you won't miss any episodes. Also, it would be great if you leave a comment, especially if it's a good one. If it's a bad one, put it on someone else's channel. You can follow us on social media. It's at Race Announcer on Twitter. There's a new Inside the SCCA every week. I'm Brian Bielanski. Have yourself a fantastic weekend. Stay safe and go play with cars.